All right, thanks for joining us, everyone. I think Alex just mentioned, but we are going to be taking questions via Slido. The code up there, feel free to scan it. Anyway, this is my first Disrupt. I've been at TechCrunch for about 6 months, which if I were a founder would probably feel like a decade. But of course, most founders don't even get that long for their investments. And yet Gene is with us here today. He founded Sila 11 years ago, spent 7 of those years in stealth, producing and working on silicon anodes for lithium-ion batteries that are going to promise to boost battery density by 20 to 40%. Gene mentioned to me that it took about twice as long as he expected to get to this point, but now the company is worth $3 billion, and it's building a gigafactory in Washington, which I understand you have some news about.
We do. Actually, just this morning, the White House announced the first $2.8 billion of awards under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and Sila was the recipient of a $100 million award that'll support the build-out of our Moses Lake factory.
That's great. Congrats.
Thank you.
Congrats.
So, Gene, as your company's grown, how would you say the landscape for long-term funding has changed?
I think it's gotten a lot better, especially in the early stages. Places like the Engine are brand new. We had to scrap for absolutely every dollar. I think there was sort of pitch 50 investors to maybe get one term sheet in the early days. But certainly in our space of electrification, kind of the world recognized that this was going to be inevitable probably about 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so that's accelerated how much money is available for this kind of technology, but also just other hard tech technologies as people see that you can win with these kind of technologies, and they also happen to be fairly counter-cyclical, right? So if you look at all the EV stocks, like they're not down the way growth stocks are down or fintech is down. So it's also good investments from that angle.
Yeah, so take us back to those early days when you were looking for investors for some of your first investments. How did you know that you found the right ones?
I don't know that I did, but I think one of the things we did was partly because I was too much of an engineer, but we would always sort of tell the whole story in gory detail, and there were only so many people that actually wanted to dig in and understand the details of battery chemistry and why this one was not going to work long term and why this one was and why this was going to be a really good bet. And so that's partly why we had to spend months with 50 investors educating them. We basically had to educate all of our investors on the market itself, and only a few ended up participating. Turned out those were sort of some of the best investors in the Valley, period, right? I mean, folks like Mike Spicer at Sutter Hill, Byron Dieter at Bessemer, and in part, I think, the same approach that they take to their other businesses, they took to this, which is you do the work, you educate yourself, you work with founders, and you figure it out. And there's a lot less competition when it's not sort of chasing that trend, right?
Yeah, so I want to dig into that a little bit more. In those early meetings, you'd mentioned to me that you'd made some mistakes. What do you feel like those were?
Oh, I made many. I don't remember which ones I told you about. But I think, for one, just being too much of an engineer sometimes. I'm very good at forgetting mistakes, and there are a lot, just to be clear. But I think kind of more importantly was building trust. And so I'll say what I think a lot of people get wrong is they say, look, we're going to deliver X by Y time frame, don't worry about the details. And the problem with hard tech things is they take twice as long. You're always, there's always something unforeseen. And so if you just do that and you fail, then the investor loses confidence and you're toast. I'm sure you guys have had this experience, right? But if you say is, look, there are these 5 problems, this is what I'm doing about each one. And the next time you say, look, we solved these 3, these 2, we haven't figured it out. Here's what we're doing now. Oh, by the way, we found these other 3. Here's what we're going to do. You actually build trust over time, and then it doesn't. It matters how long it takes, but I think the investors will give you a much longer runway, right? If you're doing that. So the mistake would be to sort of say, look, we're definitely going to hit this by this time frame, because you just don't know that that's true.
So were you transparent about that up front, that it was unclear how long it was going to take, or throughout the entire process?
Both, but I think it's especially important throughout the entire process. I think that's sort of, I think you also don't want an investor that doesn't understand the risk they're taking. So a lot of times we would literally say, look, like they go, well, this all sounds great. And it's like, yeah, I just want you to understand the risk is this, right? The risk, and today the risk for us is scaling up, another 100x to automotive volumes. Like that's very different than producing, in small consumer device electronics. That's the risk. Now, that's a much lower risk than the science we invented, the sort of hundreds of patents we achieved, the fact that we ship commercial product. Like the risk is, maybe 100 times less, but that's still where the risk is. And so I want investors that are willing to look at our team and say, look, that's the risk. This is the right team to do that.
Yeah. Milo, the engine wasn't around when Gene first started out, but if it were, how do you think you and your team would have helped?
Yeah. Maybe for those who don't know the engine, it's a venture fund that focuses on investing in companies that have the potential to solve some of the biggest challenges that we face. It means that we make a lot of investments in hardware, and we provide more than just capital. Within the engine, we have mentors and advisors that we build a network around founders, and then we also provide ready-made space that has labs, industrial workspaces, just a lot of support for those founders. And the idea is to help you get off the ground quick and get moving without a lot of capital investment.
We had the benefit of being at Georgia Tech when we were founded, and so that was sort of similar. We had access to these labs because my professor, co-founder, we wouldn't be here without that. And I think you kind of create that in a different setting that's maybe even more favorable than inside a university.
Yeah, I think it's about the ecosystem and the space, right? The combination of the two, having like-minded, ambitious founders surrounding you, and then also having the physical space with all the amenities that you need to be successful. You don't have to decide, do I want to buy that piece of equipment or not? It's just there, try it out.
Yeah. Erin, I want to get to this idea of long-term bets and how we differentiate those from other sorts of investments. How would you define a long horizon timeline for your investments?
Yeah, so Index, as a sort of multi-stage venture capital fund, we invest in a lot of software. I would say the vast majority of the companies we invest in are pure software, most of which are SaaS. We have, with our LPs, agreements about, capital timeframes and return timeframes that we have to be really conscious of. But we do make very careful bets in much longer time horizon, deeper tech companies. We invested in Aurora, Covariant, which is a AI-powered robotics for supply chain and manufacturing, some sort of harder tech AI-empowered drone companies like Cohere that are building large language models that take, months and months and months to train before there's any, potential output at the other end. And we think about those really carefully. The types of things we're looking for when we think about long-term time horizons are really sort of what is the wave that's changing in a society? Like, how can we make kind of very specific and clear bets on a much broader trend rather than necessarily bets on like particular scientific advancements? And then we really look for founders who would be building this no matter what 100 VCs said. The like missionary, they would be doing this, banging their head against the wall. If nobody gave them $1, they'd be, selling the tires off their car, figuring out how to make this happen. And if we see those two things in parallel, we'll jump in. And it might not be the case that, unlike some of our software investments, we'll see revenue in a year. We have to get really comfortable as a partnership about much longer time horizons for monetization. And that's where, to your point earlier, I think setting those clear expectations between investor and founder is really important, because then, I have to go and convince my entire team to make this bet, and I really need to trust you in order to do that.
Yeah, I think a lot of founders also forget when you're giving an update to an investor, they have their whole partnership.
There's a lot more people
and you should be thinking about those folks as you kind of give an update. But the megatrend thing you said, I think, is really interesting, because this sort of happened for us. Is even though it took us twice as long, which you'd say, look, the company should be a lot less valuable because it took twice as long to do, but the market just went up a factor of 10, and so that more than offsets sort of the fact that it takes longer. So if you have a very clear vision of how the world's going to change, even if the technology takes longer, you're likely building something even more valuable.
Yeah, if the TAM is increasing, we're much, much more likely to be comfortable with those long-term time horizons.
Yep.
Yeah, Erin, you mentioned some of those companies in your portfolio that kind of qualify for this long-term bet. How long are you looking here?
I couldn't give you a specific number. I mean, it's sort of all over the place, but definitely longer than a traditional SaaS, cloud-based SaaS software, and often with intermediate milestones in between, which might not represent the realization of the long-term vision, but our design partnerships, times to interact with customers where we're getting real validation in the shorter term before maybe the full long-term vision is realized.
Sure. So the idea is not just structuring deals for the end goal, but some of these intermediary goals. Does that kind of build transparency into the process, do you think?
It helps kind of, and I think, different companies can think about this different ways, but having this, clear signposts along the way where you can say, we're defining an intermediary milestone before maybe we hit our long-term revenue goal. What does that look like? Like, how can we get comfortable with some sort of validation in the shorter term? And that looks different for lots of different types of companies. And that's definitely something we look for.
Yeah. And Gene, I want to come back to you. Earlier we discussed some of the mistakes that you felt like you made maybe early on. Knowing what you know now, how would you do things differently?
I know I told you I'd have ideas for you, but I'm not. I'm not sure. I think one of the things is recognizing kind of that there is a lot more talent out there in the world that can help you with your specific problem earlier on. So I think it took me a while to find sort of the right, that one of the critical things with doing really long-term things is that there are people that can be so incredibly insightful, right? And I think on your specific problem, and as the company has grown and matured, we've had it become easier to attract those people, but I've also recognized the value of attracting those people, whether kind of independent directors or just advisors for the most part. And I think a lot of times a founder might get an advisor and have an interaction with them, think that it's going to be valuable, turns out not to be valuable, and so they go, advisors aren't valuable. And maybe that's true 4 out of 5 times, but the sort of one time it's not true, it's just a complete game changer for how you think about your business and how you approach it. So I think in retrospect, I think we could have done more of that sooner, even if, and just recognizing that it's a search process for that.
I think just underscoring that we end up investing in a lot of engineers that are leaders. And you think you're going to dive down deep and help them solve their technical challenges, right, with our team. But the reality is we end up working a lot more on the soft spaces, right? Like thinking about, working and coaching on team building, thinking about communication style, how do people interpret you, right? Much more focused on the soft skills, which is just so, I think, counterintuitive when you think of a place called The Engine. I'm like, it's actually focused on the soft side of supporting founders.
Well, and I tell technical founders all the time, right? They from age 6, you were trained to be really good at math and science. I was, and I think I was pretty good at it. And then you get into this position of being CEO, and you spend 20% of your time thinking about the business side of things, and if you really zoom out and go, that's really screwed up. You should be spending 95% of your time thinking about the stuff that you're trying to learn, right? But it's difficult, it's foreign, you're not good at it. You hate being not good at things, right? You're used to being A+ student all the time. So I think it's retraining your mindset that, you gotta leave those Legos behind, so to speak. Let hire people to do the technical stuff. Keep an eye on it, but then go learn the other pieces.
Yeah, and I think as we were talking about sort of those intermediary milestones and things we look at when we're thinking about long-term time horizon companies at Index, we look for people that we believe will be talent magnets. One, people who are really able, extremely self-aware and able to see talented people, to talent in others, and then really bring them in for the vision and the journey of the company, because that long-term belief and building that strong culture. And it's a lot harder to keep people motivated and sticking around when it could be 10 years or 15 years before there's an exit. And so you need that kind of storyteller, almost like that like cult builder type of personality to attract that kind of talent. And that's a key thing that we look for when investing in this type of company.
And like just on the reverse side of that, which I think is so interesting, is like we come in the pre-seed and the seed round, and so like we see ourselves actually building that capability. It's great that you're looking for it, and we're thinking about like how do we put those characteristics in place so that when that technical founder goes out to pitch, they're pitching to you, and you're seeing it.
Thank you.
So, is there anything else you want to amend as investors? So, you're coming at it from a slightly different perspective, but obviously there's things that you learned over time. How does that inform these kind of longer term bets? Because this is a different model than a lot of VCs take, right?
You asking me? The way we think about it is like, is this going to be incredibly impactful? And one metric to just think about is there are 700 million people who live with all the amenities that you and I have. And climate-wise, we're doing okay, but the reality is we have almost 8 billion people on this planet, and they all need to live with the amenities that we have. And so we look for investments that are gonna have a 10x increase in capability, right? Like, will this development help us as a community, as a society, scale from what we have today in this room to everybody on the planet having that on the planet? And so I think when you ask me like, what do we look for? We look for like real step change, game changing technologies that are gonna benefit everyone, and we think that will drive a huge TAM.
Is that something that's evolved over time, or is that something that you and the engine have kind of always brought to this space?
I think we have always brought that to this space. The engine was conceived by MIT, and the conception, the realization that they came to is that they are developing breakthrough science that has that capability to have a 10x impact on our planet, but it was not being commercialized. No one was taking those founders and helping them to support them to build these into big, huge, impactful companies. And so the engine doesn't only support MIT, it supports all founders in the tough tech space. But our feeling has always been very strongly that it's important to invest in game-changing companies.
Yeah.
I think building off something you said, it's this sort of how do you take an extremely smart scientist and turn them into an entrepreneur, and being one step down the line past you. This is something we've learned is the difference between a really smart person and a really smart person that's going to build a huge company. And it's for some of these deeper tech investments, it's where we spend the vast majority of our time up front in setting expectations and really getting to know the person. Like, do they care about the tech, or do they care about the impact? And do they care about not only the impact, but the commercial impact? Like, we want people who want to, yes, make really impactful changes to the world and also make a lot of money doing it. So we have to know that our goals are aligned, that we're here to build a $10 billion plus business and not work on a science project for 10 years. So that getting that sense of those commercial ambitions and expectations around building a business is super important for us.
And I want to riff on something Milo said too, which is the 10x impact. I think one thing that historically the venture community did not understand, that a 10x impact doesn't necessarily mean a 10x improvement in technology. A lot of times it's like a 2x improvement in something can 10x the amount of market share something has. And we're so obsessed with sort of 10x technical metrics in the Valley sometimes. I mean, I'll tell you a story. We pitched an investor early days, very well known. And I'm sitting there with the professor co-founder, and we're saying, look, the battery chemistries we work on can just about double the performance of batteries today, and that'll have this impact on the world. And they're like, yeah, we like to invest in like a 10x better battery. And professor's like, the periodic table of elements doesn't have a 10x, and they're like, yeah, but that's still what we're looking for. And I just about like, yeah, I mean, obviously like they're not an investor, and they missed out. But I think it's that, like, in some places, understanding the translation between something being 50% better and then having dominant market share in like a $10, $20 billion revenue opportunity, like that's some of the technical expertise that you need to be willing to dig into. You can hire it and, but I think it's the 10x impact that's important, not the sort of 10x better thing.
Right.
One of the cool things about the networks that we build is that they have a lot of academic leaders in specific areas, and those leaders love to work with these founders, but they also work with us, helping us understand like where's the technology going, who's making breakthroughs, like where should we be looking, right? So it's that like network is very beneficial.
Yeah. So we've got a question from the audience that I want to get to. It says, Erin, do you think the current VC funding cool down could lead to fewer investments in long-term bets and more in kind of short-term startups? So,
I actually think right now is a really good time for investors to be making long-term bets, especially at the very early stage. I think it's a time when there's a lot more sort of rolling up the sleeves from your investors and work and patience in the market, because there isn't an expectation that you're going to go raise another round in 6 months like there might have been for the last 2 years. So if you're going to do something during a hard time, you might as well do something hard and like get something out at the other end. That said, risk appetites are kind of all over the place right now with investors. We're seeing, huge variation in the market. But for index specifically, that we're really going back to first principles and saying, like, what are the platform changes of the next decade, and how do we back kind of the earliest stage founders who are really building towards that future? And there's a lot of really cool stuff happening, and a lot of very technical teams that are trying to build real products that are starting right now. And so I think it's a fantastic time to be building a sort of generational company.
Yeah. Now, both Erin and Milo, do you feel like interest rates and inflation being the highest they've been in decades is changing some of the calculus on the venture capital side?
I'm curious what you're seeing early stage. I can opine.
Yeah. I think what we see is that there's an entire generation that is completely committed to solving kind of really world huge problems. And those people are coming out of their postdocs and their PhDs, and they don't really care about the interest rates or what's going on. They just want to make a difference and have an impact. And so I don't think it doesn't seem to be swaying our side of the ship at all.
One thing we're seeing is really, really strong talent leaving larger companies, because some of the financial upside for public tech companies or maybe even late stage tech companies is sort of vaporized in the last few months. And people are like, well, I had these golden handcuffs and that was preventing me from working on what I really care about. And I don't have that anymore. So I'm going to take a risk and I'm going to do something. So actually at the earliest stage, we're seeing a lot more in the past few months, activity really picking up with people working on much bolder things than I think that they were doing a year ago, really taking bigger risks. As we get to the later stage, it's a little bit different. I think later stage companies are definitely having a harder time raising than they were a year or two ago. They're raising flat rounds, and we're and that's generally seen by the market as a success right now for later stage companies. Capital hasn't dried up, but it's certainly slowed down for some later stage companies. So it's a really good time for people to be thinking about runway and actually going back to a time when you build lean.
Right. So from your perspective, are you seeing changes in appetite for these sorts of things from LPs?
That's a very good question. LPs like sort of long-term stability and consistency, and they like to understand that your strategy isn't changing every 5 minutes when the tides of the market change. I think that's something our LPs really value about Index. And so our strategy has always been to invest in game-changing companies, and consistently over the course of our lifetime, we've had some large portion of those come from more traditional software, and some portion of those come from really exciting new bets that we saw take off. And so I think that consistency over time is really what our LPs have valued.
I think one thing that we're seeing is that as the technology public stocks come down in valuation, LPs are having to readjust the balance of their portfolio right across their public and private sectors. The good thing for us is that on the early stage side, they're not getting adjusted. They're just getting adjusted kind of like in the mid to later stage. And I think that is what's causing kind of tighter capital in the later stage private companies.
So now is basically a good time to be an early stage startup, ironically
It's a
enough.
great time to be an early stage startup.
It's always a good time to be a hard tech startup, and I think one of the reasons is that the world doesn't change just because it should. It changes because someone goes after something insanely hard and actually succeeds at it. And I think a lot of these problems actually sit around for decades until someone sees them in the right light, attacks it with the right technology. I think you can sort of ask the questions like, take an iconic company like SpaceX, could it have started 10 years before it started? And I think the answer is yes, right? And would it have been, if it hadn't started and you started 10 years later, would it have been just as successful over a similar period of time? The answer is yes, because these problems, when you're in if you're in fintech and everyone's investing in fintech and the products are going out in 12 months, right? Yeah, you have a window of opportunity. That's not the case with really hard tech. Your window of opportunity is societally long. And frankly, a lot of these problems have been there for the solving and will continue to be there for the solving for decades. It's not like a picked over set of problems.
Right, just because
by definition, right?
Yeah, just because someone's made a better rocket doesn't mean they can't make an even better one.
Or
the need will still be there.
The need. What I mean is that there's other parts of society that need huge solutions, right? I think it's a lot harder to build a rocket company now that SpaceX exists, and the increment to perfection is much smaller. But there's so many parts of our society that are so far away from efficient, right? And they're gated by someone having a really innovative solution. And so I think it's always a good time to start a hard tech company, unlike things that have 18-month cycles. There are windows for those.
Yeah. So Gene, Sila earned a Great Place to Work certification for being a welcoming, caring, transparent company. You used to work for Elon Musk at Tesla. Is that a response to what you saw there?
Provocative question. I think I've learned a lot of great things from different places, and I think a lot of ways your company is shaped by the first 20 or 30 people you hire. And so, the things we were selecting for were, exceptional talent, but also sort of folks that want to go the distance. And I think we have a very long average tenure at Sila, in part because of the type of problem we're solving. And I think to enable that, you sort of need to create a culture where people want to be for 10 plus years. I think if you're solving problems that are more cyclical, the same kind of problem, 4 or 5 times, you maybe want a different culture to do that. But I think for us, having a really long duration culture, scientific knowledge accumulates, and the insight that a scientist who's been with us for 10 years can have, literally no one else in the world can have. And so coming back to solving really hard problems that sit there for a long time until someone comes up with a solution, we're trying to create an environment where that knowledge accumulates, those people learn. You can't pass that stuff down in a PowerPoint.
Right. Now, Erin, I know you've got maybe a slightly different perspective. You said one of your more provocative thoughts is that teams are either machines or cults. And I'll be honest, that doesn't always sound terribly welcoming. So, where do humans
Cults
fit
are
in?
very welcoming.
Yeah.
I don't know the last cult you visited, but if they're not welcoming, they're not cult for long.
So, where do people fit in that, and how do you make sure you're not backing the next Adam Newman?
That's a really good question. So I spent the bulk of my career before becoming an investor as an engineer at Palantir, which I would definitely classify as a cult. And I loved it. I absolutely worked my ass off. And you're, creating this culture where you're really in the fire. You look around the table and you're like, these are my people. Like, I would die for them. I'm like, going to the ends of the earth for them. And it's, it's a private company. Like,
right.
But it had that power of kind of creating a sense of shared mission and vision. I think it still has to start from a place of respect and a place of shared values. And the creation of the cult, if you will, is really a capturing of a hard and complex goal that a group of people want to reach together. And if you're able to sort of distill that into this sense of purpose and mission and belonging, you can move mountains. And alternatively, there are very successful companies that don't look like that, where people have a really clear sense of what their goals are from week to week and where they belong in the org and how things are structured and who they report to. And that can also be a great way to build a company. I tend to gravitate a little bit more towards the cult leaders just from my background and experience.
Yeah. Milo, the engine does it maybe a little bit differently, and I think you alluded to this before, where you're taking the scientists who maybe aren't ready to be cult leaders. Maybe it doesn't go that far, but maybe they don't have those the soft skills that would be required to kind of like engender the sort of following that you might need as an early stage startup. So what does it look like as you're training scientists to become founders?
Yeah. First, I would say that there are a pretty strong number of mentors out there that are technical leaders, have built strong companies, much like Gene, and surrounding our founders with people like those who have shown like, this can be done. You can do this. Let me show you how to do this. But we also do a lot of psychology work with them, having them learn about themselves, what kind of people they are, learn about the different kinds of people that are out there. How do they think? How do they digest information? How do you motivate them to give you 110%? And so we also do a lot of psychology work just to dig in and help them understand themselves and the people around them and how they're going to kind of lead that cult.
Yeah. So I want to start to wrap up a little bit. My perspective on long-term investments comes from the climate side. My background is environmental science, and I write about climate tech all the time. These are very hard, very long challenges that we face. And as I was sitting down preparing for this, I was thinking about the timeline, right? We basically have until 2050 to get to net zero. That's about 30 years. And when we're thinking about these longer time horizon investments, that's about 2 investment cycles, which does not sound like very much. So one question I have is like, 1, what the hell are other investors doing? Right? Not getting in on this. And 2, are there enough founders out there?
Yeah. I mean, to the second question is, the interesting thing I think is I don't think it's going to be solved by 1,000 companies doing something little. I think there's going to be a few companies that really have outsized impact, and then a lot of companies that have a modest impact. I think you need the tent poles, and I think those are so much more important because they drag everything along. And so I think the question isn't, the question is, do you have the tent poles? If you have the tent poles, then I think you're going to get a lot of tailwinds, and I think Tesla's clearly a tent pole for the world on this. And from a climate perspective, there's actually, it's not easy, but it is simple. There are only 3 things you really have to solve. You have to electrify transportation, decarbonize the grid, and decarbonize industrial heat.
Is that it?
That's it. But it's those 3 things. And so in some ways, I think your tent poles could be a half dozen companies. And I think, I'm obviously like a huge optimist, and we're going to go solve this. And if no one else shows up, then we'll solve it. But I think, and so I think there's not as many bets to make, and I'd rather have a few really sophisticated investors with really big checkbooks to make those bets than necessarily having every VC try to chase this stuff.
Yeah, Erin and Milo, do you have examples of who else might be stepping up? Feel free to name names.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the steel and cement side, there's some real breakout leaders in that space. Boston Metals in our portfolio, they're making 0 carbon steel. it's unbelievable. We're super excited for them. Steel accounts for 6% of all carbon emissions globally annually. So resolving what's happening on steel will be absolutely amazing. Yeah, we also have another portfolio company, Sublime, which is decarbonizing cement. Cement is also, I think it's 5 or 6% of all CO2 emissions. It's also really big. And so just solving those two big industrial emitters will be a huge step in the right direction.
One of the ways we've thought about climate investing, and we have at this point a number of companies in our portfolio in the climate side, is actually following talent. One of the best ways to judge and evaluate a company is the quality of people that go there. And so we look for people who are making trade-offs in their personal lives and careers and taking bets on companies and founders and spaces and joining these these focal points of the movement. And that's often a lens we use to look at which climate companies are and which areas are really getting a ton of focus, because convincing people to join your company, to risk their life and career on your bet is a huge signal of success. So in addition to relying on folks like you to help on the science side, and that's something we're seeing more and more in the last 2 years, and I think especially now with the sort of weakening public markets, there's an exodus of people who are looking for meaning, value, and to create impact, and we're following right along.
I think it goes beyond just people joining those companies. There are founders. I'm friends with a couple who have built multi-billion-dollar software companies, sold them, could retire on the beach the rest of their lives,
Yeah.
and they're working like as hard as anyone I know starting climate companies now.
Yeah.
And I think it's like follow that lead, right? I think they're and second-time founders are statistically a lot more successful because they don't make the dumb mistakes people like me made.
Yeah, it's a remarkable trend that we're seeing. Well, we're just about out of time, so I want to thank Jean, Erin, and Milo for joining us, and thank you all as well.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Thanks.